Well, good morning, Greg. I think it's one of those that we're just going to jump straight into it. That we've been dominated in the news by the Defence Investment Plan. Just by context, the Defence Review was published earlier on last year. They said they were going to have that was the plan. Vision without funding is hallucination. So you've got to have the money to match it. That was due out in autumn, and it's almost a year later that it's actually come out. Loads of comments about it. What I'd like to start with, I guess, is the money, because that seems to have dominated a lot of the newspapers. My first comment on it, just to tee you up, I think, is that you and I have got, well, I've got a lot more grey hair than you have, but we've been around a bit. I think it's actually, whatever the details around it, it's rather nice to see an uplift in defence spending and a not insignificant uplift in defence spending. But of course, that's not what's dominated the news. What's been your take on the financial envelope?
Yeah, look, the news yesterday was almost completely dominated, wasn't it, by the money side of this? And obviously, the money's important. You can't do any of this without cash. Um, let's put cards on the table. Would defence want more money and more money more quickly? Yes, of course it would. So let's at least part the fact that we're on a very slow growth path, but the 3%, the 3.5% downstream are welcome if they arrive. There's all this talk about the so-called missing 4.7 billion because government hasn't yet found the source of all this money. I'm kind of a bit more sanguine about that. I think for the Labour government now to renege on the deal they effectively announced with the dip, I think would be almost political suicide. So they're going to have to find the money somewhere. Goodness knows where. But I think the truth is there is some smoke and mirrors going on. There's clearly, we've eked a little bit more out with Dan Jarvis. But there's also potentially been quite a shift in the focus of the dip and what it's spent on and how it's spent. So there's that as a factor as well. But look, you and I have lived through numerous direct defence reviews where it's all been about cuts. So heaven forbid this one actually puts new money in. The problem is the situation in defence right now is such that it needs a lot more new money.
Yeah, and I guess the bit stepping back from our national conversation about the money, because I absolutely get how difficult it is. There is no money at the moment. You've got to reprioritize, and that means probably welfare or taxes, and both of which are political suicide. What I find is interesting is that you were quite active on X the other day, talking about the 2030, 2029, the timescales for some of this. And I think what's interesting is that when you overlay our nation's commitment to NATO, which talked about 2030, 3% of GDP, 2035, 3.5% GDP, they look very, very difficult to achieve. And I think there was an expectation, particularly given that in a matter of days, early part of next week is the NATO summit in Ankara. And of course, as you and I both know, that's the sort of culmination of weeks, maybe months of effort. The UK has been gradually slipping down the league table of our percentage GDP that we spend on defence at a time when Trump, Europe, everybody else seems to be recognizing that their significant uplift needs to happen. I guess my take is, how do you square that circle then? It seems likely to me that Starmer's going to come in from a fair bit of criticism next week in Ankara, and yet we actually this dip didn't actually go out to 2030, did it? What's your take on that?
So, God, there's so much to unpack here. Well, let's first of all give the government some credit. It might be quite challenging to do this, but I'm going to give it a go. It has said it will get to 3.5% by 2035, which is the NATO pledge. So in theory, because it is still going to be Keir Starmer, can walk into Ankara saying, yeah, we're on the path to get to the promise that we made. How we get there, yeah, we'll bump along the road, but we're going to get there. There's a big argument about whether 3.5 by 2035 is enough, but that was the pledge to NATO. The second thing they've done is they have stuck to the parameters that they gave the SDR team, i.e. an envelope at to 2.5%, looking to increase beyond in the next parliament. So they've actually met the sort of envelope that they said they would set. Now, of course, the Defence Review authors said that they achieved an affordable plan. Well, that's turned out to not be true. Now, I don't know where these missing billions have crept in. whether there was an underestimation of the damage and the risk already there, whether someone's done heroic assumptions on efficiencies, cost of programs, etc. We may not find out for years, but I'm sure somebody one day will write a history of this. So that's the first thing. Is they haven't broken their promises. Now the real question is, how does that money turn up and when? We won't find out about the 3% delivery until the next spending review. That will declare a date and a profile to get there. And whilst we're arguing about 4.7 billion today, we're talking about 20 plus billions a year in the future years. So that's a significant uplift. So the good news is defense here is talking about growth. The question is with what? And the other question is, yeah, we've said this before, but, we never delivered. So I think that those are my first opening salvos on this, in that it is not as bad as everyone's making out, but it could have been better. And the real question is it enough? And I think we'll explore that.
Yeah, and I think again, just sticking with the sort of macro at the moment, you and I both lived through the sort of post-Cold War era where we've gone from over 4% down to 2% GDP, and largely it's not so much the summer money; it's more what it's been spent on. We've been expeditionary, traveling abroad, providing armored kit for our army colleagues when they get on the ground, and the like. Now this wars of national survival, we've actually saved well over £1 trillion in the peace dividend. So you can't suddenly squirt that money back in and just suddenly popping up to 4% again, even if we were able to. You've still got a legacy of underinvestment that you've got to put right. So the point being at the moment, I think, is that whilst I absolutely welcome an uplift, the danger is we keep focusing on 3% or 3.5% rather than actually capability. And my worry here is that, for example, integrated air and missile defences, we can pick on that one as an example, but there's less than £1 billion in that pot. A lot of it's around communications connectivity and sensing. I don't see very much on effectors at all in there. And I guess it just illustrates the scale of the problem that's facing the country, that even if you could go to 5% GDP, you won't be able to solve the nation's defense problems for decades. And that's the worry about us arguing away about 0.1, 0.2% of GDP. When we actually get into the detail, I think it's going to be decades before we get this country back onto a robust defense footing.
There's definitely a huge recovery program, let's be honest, whether it's pay, conditions, housing, recruitment, spares, logistics, infrastructure, all of that needs money. And I think, unfortunately, some of those non-war fighting things that Labour were beginning to address, and to be fair, still are, those are the ones that are probably going to go by the wayside in order to make this affordable. So if you remember, the 28 billion shortfall figure was the one that was being bandied around by lots of people. Goodness knows the provenance of it. My understanding is, if you stripped out the nice to haves from the 28, you could actually get down to around 18. Now, government allegedly has given 15. Of course, there's lots of arguments about where it's not a bucket of money sat in a drawer in Rachel Reeves' office, but the idea that 15 billion is new cash over 4 years. So in theory, we can fill some of these holes, but it won't happen overnight. It's going to take you a long time to build. £11 billion for munitions. I mean, that's a huge amount of money and very welcome. But that in itself tells a story of how empty the locker was to start with, if you're having to spend 11 billion to fill it back up. But you're not going to build a golden dome. You're just not. So yes, you're absolutely right on the IAMD argument. I think 3/4 of that money is primarily for joining sensors and networks together. So it's a better sense and warn system, and it only talked about some short range drone intercept capabilities at selective sites. So yeah, we're obviously trying to hedge our bets here on what the most likely threat is, still relying on Typhoon to do the heavy lifting and a little bit of Type 45 on the ballistic missile capability.
Before we leave this big Canval stuff, I mean, I've read a couple of articles over the last couple of days that talked about national choices, and one of those was if Andy Burnham, incoming prime minister, if he is the incoming prime minister, says, when you and I both know that you set an ambition for the nation, That's what the SDR then works out. How do you fulfill that ambition? And then can you afford it? If you go, well, actually, let's work backwards now. Are we really a great British Empire anymore, or are we a tiny island nation? Are we a long way away from Russia? Is our ambition still to be sat at the head table, still doing lots of war fighting and influencing, and therefore we've got to pay a premium to be at that position? Or does Andy Burnham say, no, I'm not happy with this. I don't think we need to be at the forefront. I'm going to set a different ambition for the SDR, much more focused on defence rather than offence, playing a smaller part in NATO, commensurate with the size of our nation. And it, when you read it, you sort of think there's a lot of things that resonate in there, because there are people you must bump into them all the time as well, that talk around and go, can we really, are we playing too big for our boots on the global stage? Should we be more practical and live within our budget rather than actually trying to have a place at the top table of NATO?
Yes, is all of the above. I mean, I don't think Andy Burnham's going to change the defence review significantly. I think the dip, he'll kind of want to put that on the done list. He'll have plenty of other problems to solve, but he clearly has got an issue with finding that money downstream. I mean, the UK is still, I think, the sixth largest defence budget in the world. So let's just get that on the table, notwithstanding the percentages and where we are in the league table of percentages. In true cash terms, we're in the top 10. The question is, how do we get the right bang for our buck for that money? We are not an empire, okay? We clearly need to break that ambition. I think, unfortunately, some commentators have that's passed them by, and they still think we need to be sailing the waves far and beyond. But we are still a major player, and I maybe the best analogy here was like a mid-tier supplier in industry. We're not the big prime in the room. That is America or China, but we're not an SME. So we definitely got something to add here in terms of our leadership. The problem is we've lost a bit of moral authority recently, and I think it hasn't helped that the country's beaten itself up over that. So it's all been bad news, not good news. I think there are still things that we do out there that people value. We are still in all the right places around NATO, doing all the right things. I think our people are still valued. Our views are still valued. So in terms of a leadership role, I think there is still a function for the UK. We're one of the two nuclear powers within NATO that's not American. So we can't dismiss all that as if, oh dear, the UK slipped down to last in the table.
I guess my point I get that, but let's pick up the nuclear point. We pay a significant chunk of change out of the money we spend on nuclear, which, as you say, we're only one of three nations in NATO. France is ourselves and America. So that means that the level of money that we have available for conventional stuff you use routinely is obviously diminished significantly because of that, particularly at the moment because of Dreadnought coming in. I do wonder, though, whether you and I are actually victims of this history as well, that we can see the benefits of sitting at the top table. We can see the benefits of being on America's shoulder when they're doing some of this stuff to try and control. But if I was trying to look at it through an Andy Burnham lens, it might be that, yeah, but to do that, we've got to give up a chunk of welfare. To do that, we've got to curtail our National Health Service. To do that, is that actually something that's to do with our ego rather than actually something that we need to do as a nation? And therefore, how do we stop it being played back at us? Oh, you senior officers, you want to be sat at the table with the senior officers of America, rather than actually practically, why do we want to be playing at the Premier Division?
Yeah, I think all those challenges are valid. You could argue we've been drifting into this position for 20, 30 years. I mean, actually, France is the best comparator here, isn't it? We should be a bit like France in terms of shape, size, value for money. It does appear that France seems to get more value for its money and tends to buy homegrown products. So, is that the model we should aspire to? Have we become a little bit too wedded into the US? But you're also right about the nuclear enterprise. For whatever reason, that has nearly broken the bank. And when you strip that out from the defence budget, the conventional budget is actually quite tight. I'm being polite by using that word. And that is the issue for us. And if you don't have conventional power, just being the little island sat at the back with a strategic nuke, is a bit of a weird place to sit. So yeah, I think the UK has over time, without thinking through the strategy here, has drifted into the mid-table without deciding whether it wants to spend the money to compete for the Champions League or just avoid relegation. And it feels a bit like the latter, doesn't it?
It does, and my argument, I think, is that America, several thousand miles away, is ultimately the strategic guarantor of all this stuff. You know, if things went horribly wrong, we'd rather hope they'd step in. But a European heavy NATO that deals with European problems feels like the right answer. France is in the middle of Europe, feels the heat slightly more of the Russian invasion because its neighbours are the neighbours of Russia and the like. So they probably have to focus a little bit more towards that campaign. Europe, sorry, the UK as one of the other nuclear powers and a bridge to America probably has to focus on the maritime threat because most of our European colleagues are not going to be necessarily focused on that in the way that historically we have. And therefore, air and maritime capability for us seems to be where we would take the lead, high north, Atlantic, anti submarine warfare, and the like. And therefore, it feels to me there's a different, slightly different model that we, France and the UK take a sort of not leading role, but a semi-leadership role in those two key areas of defence for Europe, and therefore that would justify why we needed to make sure that we were leaning in. All of that leads me down the path, of course, that you need to have a robust navy, which I know is strange for an Air and Space Power Association podcast, but of course it only works if you have air power to support it. So it feels like that is but that's not the way the SDR was written.
No, and if you go back in time, even into Tony Radakin's time, so a good couple of years back, when the review was being written and being considered, waiting for the next government to arrive, there was a view that you had to make a choice. There wasn't going to be enough money to fix it all, so you had to make a choice. Yes, NATO first is the first choice you make, and we've clearly made that. The DIP has re-emphasised that. But then you've got a call. Do you, as you say, focus on the air and maritime element, particularly because of our geography and our specialisation? We are good in both of those areas. And let the European continental nations do the army bit. The problem is in the UK, the idea that the UK would take risk on its army is we are shaped by our history. I think Rich Knighton actually said this, didn't he, last week at the RUSI conference, that is our history and our culture and tradition holding us back. Now, I think he meant about technology, but it also, because what we'll see within seconds in the newspapers is it's the smallest army since the Napoleonic Wars. What the relevance of the Napoleonic Wars is to say, God only knows. But, we've got to get away from the idea that we've just got to have a bit of everything. And I think at the moment we're still in that mindset of spinning every plate and holding on to a little bit of everything, and rather than, prioritize and focus on what you can do. So, yeah, the SCR has been fairly even-handed. And I think governments, whether they know it or not, do get beaten up politically about the size of the army, the size of the Navy. The Air Force actually tends to be left alone a little bit, either because we're just getting on with it, or it's not, the tradition isn't there because we don't have 100 years, and the Napoleonic Wars definitely didn't involve us. So, yeah, it's...
But that I think is a really interesting point, because I wonder what's been going on behind the scenes of this. I mean, my understanding is that they didn't delay the dip for a year because they wanted to. It was almost certainly that the funding available didn't match what needs to be done. Then you decide, well, who are the priorities? And my understanding is, the army, God knows what the core of their argument, what's their role now, because if we're focused on wars of national survival, we're an island nation. Now, I'm not for 1 second dismissing the role the army, but the premise of it before was we need boots on the ground when we do expeditionary warfare. What is its role today? But you've got the Navy, who is in a pretty poor place because of the investments in the carrier and stuff like that. And I don't take any pleasure in that. I think we've got to invest properly and bring that back up to scratch. And the danger is, of course, the Air Force has been this first responder for the last year or so. We've seen the critical importance of control of the air, whether it's been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, America decimating Iran because Iran had no answer to the air power. But it felt like I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was the Air Force is okay. Let's focus on rebuilding the Navy. And you're going, how on a minute. What you've just identified is that we're running white hot in the Air Force. Air and space needs to be an investment for the future because that is going to be the first responder for some time to come. You need to get your Navy back onto an even keel, literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, very clever.
Thank you. I'm available at weekends. And um, and I think that must have been a key part of what's delayed all of this because this is grown up sitting in a room, and it's not just Navy, Air Force, Army put an equal spoonful of gruel in each of your bowls. It's got to be led by what does the nation need at the moment, and I
Yeah.
think therefore that's been. I mean, let's pick up on a specific. So the one thing that caught my eye was there's a lot of move towards uncrewed systems, whether it's air, land, or maritime, and this digital targeting web. Um, and I have to say, I think this is an interesting one because I'm a bit of a skeptic. And don't get me wrong, if this stuff works, fantastic. But if you've seen the latest episodes of Clarkson's Farm, and he gets an autonomous tractor in, and he gets it going, and it stops first time, and Caleb's laughing his head off. Now, later in the program, it does seem to be delivering its stuff, but so what's your take on this big push towards? Are we doing it because it's the future, or are we doing it because we can't afford the real thing?
Well, the good news is Jeremy Clarkson and Caleb are not running the Air Force, but yes, I hear your skepticism, and I have been a skeptic too, and I think deep down I still am. But even an old crusty die-in-the-wool, traditionalist recognizes that the world is moving and it's moving quickly. The question is, have we had to jump to that new tech early because we don't have the money to do both things simultaneously? And I think that is a fair criticism and is therefore a massive risk in the way this dip is now going to proceed. If you're America and you've got money to burn, you do both. You're buying conventional platforms, you're building F-15s, you're building F-35s, and you're building CCAs, the collaborative combat aircraft. And then as time goes on, you build your confidence, you build your trust, and you start to shift. But you shift having a backup plan. In the UK, the dip looks remarkably like we have decided to jump without the safety net. And therefore, we're not going to invest in some of the conventional platforms as much as we would like. Navy is a particularly good example of that. And the hybrid Navy is the future. Now, to be fair, Gwyn Jenkins has been saying that for some time, not just when the dip came out. And the Air Force has been talking about drones and CCAs. It has its ACP strategy, autonomous combat platforms. So they are not being dragged to a place they weren't ready to go to. The question is, have they had the safety net taken away by being told, okay, go there now. And by the way, you're not going to have any conventional backup. You've got to live with what you've got. That is where we are. And I think the Army, to a large extent, has been forced down that route too, because a lot of its heavy stuff, just isn't either working or hasn't been invested in. So the positive, I'm going to make one positive out of this. If this works, we genuinely would be a sixth generation military that everyone else will go, wow, we should be doing more of that. We've hedged our bets. We've done a bit of both. We've done a lot of conventional. We've done a little bit of tinkering. So the UK could become a lead nation here in that regards, and everyone will be saying, how did you do that? Digital targeting web being a key part of that. We can talk a bit more about that in a minute. So that's the positive. The negative is we are doing it without the net underneath us.
Yeah, so two things on that. One of which I was out with Sam Vai last night, Chief Executive SARS, and they do a lot of automated helicopters and uncrewed stuff. And the word he kept using was attritable. In other words, they're disposable. In other words, you compensate for exquisite quality with quantity. And therefore, you're back into the drone argument. Some will get through. The trouble is, I wish I could remember the name of the Army drone that was used in the Gulf War. We bought thousands of them that were fairly substantial size, but they just were completely attritable, and we just lost loads of them. And all of a sudden, it became you can't afford to lose them. There's a price point where you go, this just isn't isn't possible. So first of all is, if they become vulnerable, the only time I've really nearly lost my life in an air-to-air collision was with an American Reaper over Afghanistan in a stack at night, and this bloody thing was not in the right height block,
Yeah.
and it whistled past my ear. And you imagine some bloody operator sat on a beach in Florida somewhere with a big banana daiquiri going, oh, sorry about that. Oh yeah, I'm in the wrong height block.
Just for our listeners, they don't do it like that, but I take your analogy.
You claim they don't, but it felt like that at the time. The second concern is that you and I've watched these Chinese drones doing these amazing displays, light displays, and the lighted, and then somebody flicks a switch and half of them fall out of the sky.
Yeah. So the dip tries to cover this by talking about the high-low mix. So what you're going to end up doing is buying some high-end weapons to do the difficult stuff, i.e. penetrate a well-defended area, probably hardened, plenty of decoying, lots of ECM. So you're going to have to pay a lot of money to defeat those things. Now, that I think is the missile that we're talking about here for the Air Force's Stratus. This is this joint effort with the Germans, and that ultimately will replace the Storm Shadow, which everyone gets excited about retiring. We had that in the 80s.
Well, it's
late,
over 30
late
years
80s.
ago, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's just be wary here of hanging on to things just for the sake of it. Although we did put them in sealed boxes that cost us a fortune to make them last a long time, but they must be coming close to the end of their life.
Yeah, we made the money back because we then gave them to Ukraine. We were going to have to pay to dispose of them, but we actually gave them to Ukraine and then counted the full cost, 2 million each, against our contribution.
Well, hold that thought, because having a war to develop in is perhaps quite a key factor in here, and Ukraine obviously provides the opportunity for that, as terrible as that sounds. So the high-low mix will absolutely have these attritable one-way systems to do the easy stuff. I'm going to be a bit rude, but in their thousands. Yeah, it is the new artillery. Now, a soldier will argue, certainly a gunner will argue, you still need artillery. You can't, and okay, fine. That debate is still raging, and that's for the army to solve. The idea that you'll still do close air support in the future, I'm struggling with. I mean, if you've got these drones, surely that is now purvey for them to manage. So for the Air Force now, it is about the deeper strike and the tougher missions. So there's a question still about what weapons will you put on your F-35s and your GCAPs in order to prosecute some of these targets. That's where you'll spend the money. And have less of them. But instead of having to hit targets with hundreds or thousands, one or two will do, because they have the explosive power and penetration to do the job. So there is absolutely a place for both here. And I think the challenge for the dip is, how do you try and do both things? The other problem is with drones is, the development is so quick. And as we're seeing in Ukraine, that how do you do that when you're not at war? And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance here of the supply chain to Ukraine and the lessons learned in Ukraine and the feedback loop that provides to industry, that's allowing companies like the one you've met to thrive, because they've got money coming in. Does the MOD want to go and buy 10,000 drones today that are going to be out of date tomorrow? So that's a real business problem to solve. And I think at the moment, Ukraine is basically bailing us out of that challenge. But if the Ukraine war came to a stop and that supply chain suddenly dropped off, the business model that we need to apply is not yet being thought of.
No, and that, I think we've talked before. I'm a big fan of a sort of adaptation of the Schneider Trophy idea, where you have national competitions, where you have universities, schools, SMEs, big players all doing drone wars, blue air, red air, and people in white coats can go and drag some of these youngsters out and go, you need to come and have a chat with us because you've got some really clever ideas.
I was listening to the radio yesterday, and they're doing another study into drone delivery to prisoners, getting into prisons. I mean, we should have the regiment of the army outside trying all the new tactics.
I don't understand why we can have aces in and yet we still have a struggle with that. Before we get onto the one thing I'd also noticed away from the front line was that they've agreed they're going to replace the Hawk and the training aircraft, but also, interestingly, a commitment to the Red Arrows. I thought this was going to be the death knell of the Red Arrows, because I just couldn't see the country, the services agreeing to buy a complete set of new airplanes for what is essentially an air show aircraft that's not actually advertising British goods anymore because it won't be a British product. What was your take on that?
Yeah, well, the good news is there is money to do that, and it's not a small sum of money either. So, a new fast jet training system and a Hawk replacement. We now know that that is not going to be a British aircraft. It may well be assembled here, or it may be in partnership with a British company, BAE Systems, for example. So there'll be some UK business within it. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see how we negotiate that deal. I mean, if I was the negotiator and I was buying a foreign product, I would make quite a lot out of the fact that I'm going to be displaying your aircraft around the world with the great and beloved red arrows. So where's my discount, mate? So yeah, let's wait and see how the deal goes through and how many aeroplanes are bought and how that works between training and the Reds. You might have to come up with a really quite novel model where the Reds live basically on the same airfield you're doing your fast jet training system. And Jehovah, there'll be a lot of people who'll be throwing things at the TV now. But you might just have to have that shared fleet where you can get a scale, economy of scale, and manage the maintenance centrally, etc. So yeah, it is good news. Unfortunately, and I hate it, is the Air Force then gets reflected on. Well, you must have plenty of money if you can still afford the red arrows. Therefore, you obviously don't need much cash. And that is a cross to bear for the Air Force. I think the honest view is if the Air Force tomorrow said we're going to scrap the red arrows, number 10 will be straight over the road saying no, you're not. That is, I mean, that's the one presence right now around the US, celebrating the independence.
Yeah, but it's an interesting rabbit hole, isn't it? I'm a bit schizophrenic about this. I was stood on the roof of a PwC or PA building in London watching the Kings fly past, and genuinely, there's a tear in your eye as the nine fly ship goes past, and it is something. There's something to be proud of nationally, but also that the crew in there, they're all fighter pilots. They've all been incredibly well trained. They've got multi-million-pound training packages and experience behind them. Is that a wise use of taxpayers' money, particularly defence budget? And I genuinely, I'm hugely proud of them, but it's also at what cost? And I was just intrigued to see, and they're going to have to get on with it pretty quickly because they need, is 2030, I think the Hawks run out of steam, and we're 2026, clock's ticking.
I mean, one of the things we used to do, if you remember, was we used to have a war roll for these aircraft, the old T1s. They used to sort of sit as the loyal wingmen of their day, the CCA of their day, sat on an F3 or an F4 wing. I think and I don't know how many of those training aircraft in the competition are capable of at least doing something in UK defence, short range drone defence. I don't know. And you switch the Reds and you switch the training schools into a war role. We haven't had that for a while. Maybe there needs to be a bit of lateral thinking there. But you're right. It is hard to justify the luxury of the red arrows, marching bands, et al. But again, it's the tradition of the services that you find really hard to let go.
Yeah, and I think the point you made earlier was for me the right one. I don't think this is something the Air Force needs to defend. It's something number 10 doesn't want to see go away. And just to draw us back out to the sort of operational bit as well, because obviously we're air and space. One of the things that this uncrewed systems relies on is this digital targeting web. In other words, it feels like an internet of the skies, so that you're operating in an ecosystem where you can share information. Because obviously, if you haven't got a pilot sat in the cockpit of these things, then you need to be communicating with them a fair bit. I noticed there was less than $1 billion. I think it was 880 million for space control and surveillance. Of course, there's not a lot said about that for obvious reasons. There's lots of sensitivity and security around that. But it does feel we're heading to a world in which this will be one of our critical vulnerabilities. How do we make sure that we invest enough in space to protect all of this? We still feel heavily reliant on America for this because that's ultimately where the big bucks are spent. And this digital targeting web, is it something that is going to be a NATO idea? Because it has to be NATO if it's going to work. Is it something we are investing in? And the danger is of us doing it is we are the Betamax when the rest of the world is investing in VHS. What's your take on that?
Yeah, all of those are valid criticisms. I mean, I think that is perhaps the one story that's not emerged from this. So if you take the logic of a sixth generation military, it is network enabled capability, as you and I remember. NECs, we had combat clouds, and all of that stuff, all those promises that were going to come and solve all our problems. And at the time, the tech just wasn't there, or it meant you were going to rely heavily on a third party provider. We are now approaching the point where that tech does exist. It clearly exists, whether it's quantum computing, which is still a bit of a way off, but quantum is mentioned in the dip. But certainly AI is now a thing. Most people are using it at home, let alone in war scenarios. We know that Ukraine are doing a lot of things in that space. But it's all enabled. The network has to function, so you've got to maintain your connectivity. And if a lot of that is through space, so you've got to maintain your space capability. And if you've only got one or two nodes that you're using, they become quite vulnerable, obviously. And we know that Russia and China are more than willing to play nasty in space. So yeah, being able to protect your network is fundamental. Otherwise, your sixth gen suddenly becomes third or second gen. Just dumb lumps of objects flying around, not talking. And same with CCAs. If your drones don't have a network to connect to, how do they know what to do or where to go? So it is fundamental here. And the real question for all of us is, how much risk are we now going to put into those networks? And how do we therefore protect them? I think there was quite a lot in the space. Obviously, much of it will be classified, but there's lots of hints in there about how we seek commercial solutions to some of this. There are thousands of commercial satellites up there. Starlink's one of the obvious ones. Where's the sort of NATO version of Starlink with high levels of redundancy, low cost, easily relaunched? So if you get a hole, you fill it the next day. So all of those questions, and I do hope that NATO is looking at this problem in the round. I'm sure it is. The question is, I'm not an expert on STANAGs anymore, which are the standard agreements where everyone's work uses the similar software or similar protocols. And we absolutely need to make sure that when we've all created our bespoke little networks, that they can actually talk to each other.
The final thing I want to get into is going back to big picture stuff. I mean, the Air Force control of the air is a major one for obvious reasons that you and I well understand. I was quite surprised in a way that the DIP seemed to put quite a lot of money into things like GCAP, things like Typhoon, things like F-35A, things like these collaborative combat aircraft, all of which points towards what people say we could well be the first sixth gen Air Force. That seemed a very positive sign. And I wasn't sure that the government was actually going to back GCAP the way it has, because it's put a hell of a lot of money into that program now. Is that, do you think, because the French collaborative thing has fallen through, that actually, therefore, the one program in Europe is GCAP, and by partnering with the Italians and the Japanese, then actually we keep a program going that could well leave us in the driving seat, and therefore potentially with a really prosperous future? The reason I'm asking the question is because, generally speaking, governments don't think beyond their own 4-year period. GCAP is way out there, way beyond, and this is a significant chunk of change into that program.
Yeah, and if you strip that, I think 8.6 billion out of the air domains money, it's over a third of the cash going to the Air Force. So the Air Force aren't going to see quite a lot of their money for quite a long time. So yes, you're right, but they have invested in the future, which is a good thing. Don't underestimate the power of the unions or BAE Systems lobby team. And I think that has been hugely attractive to Labour in terms of generating skills and keeping the aerospace industry alive in that high end area. So yeah, it is welcome. And I think the fact that FCAS has fallen by the wayside, actually, there's a huge opportunity here in export. We see Canada, on the margins now, and heaven forbid Germany, and maybe not France, maybe they'll go their own way. But you could see a lot more people here buying into GCAP, which would make it far more viable and far more valuable as a program. But it does take away a lot from the Air Force in that respect. So I think there was a time, maybe about a year ago, where I think government might have been sorely tempted to say, hey, Air Force, you've mostly recapitalized. You've got some great stuff. You seem to be doing okay. How about we just give you GCAP and you just run along and make the rest of it, you cope with the rest of it. I think there would have been a temptation to do that a year ago. I think we've got the Iran war to thank, perhaps. We've also got Russia to thank. And we've got the fact that we've had typhoons in Romania, in the Baltic states, in Cyprus, in the Middle East, and patrolling around the North Atlantic. And notwithstanding what the F-35s have done also on the back of that. So, you can't suddenly go, we're going to disinvest in the one thing that's keeping you safe at home or abroad. So I think it's quite welcome that F-35 is still in the game. And Typhoon has been given a new lease on life into the 2040s. Is a bit vague about dates, but that's good. Otherwise, we were going to be seeing a very gradual drawdown of Typhoons over the next 10, 15 years. And hopefully they'll also be kept upgraded so they'll be relevant to the wars that we fight, albeit with these CCAs in the mix around them. So, yeah, I think the Air Force has actually come out of it better than it might have done. And yet there are down arrows. So Shadow's going to go. Older Chinooks are going to go. Shadow will be replaced by Protector, will do the role in the benign environment. And New Medium Helicopter will do a bit of what Chinook does. And there's a question mark about why would you fly helicopters around the battlefield in a modern battlefield, question mark. And that's why Wildcat's also going, or certainly the battlefield version. So there was no up arrows, if you remember reading between the lines. We've not seen any up arrows on E7s. So we're still stuck at 3, which is a woefully small number. No discussion on boom tanking, but I think that's going to have to come, especially if the A model does come about, and that clearly is back on the table. And that's a big deal. Lots of people think it's an Air Force agenda to kill carrier strike by getting rid of Bs. Going back into the air tactical nuclear role is a big deal. Now, by all means, criticize it. I happen to be a fan. You know that I did it when I was a boy. So I absolutely see the value of that in deterring Russia in today's environment, particularly if America are a little bit backward leaning, albeit this would be with an American weapon. So there's lots of other things in there that we're probably not going to get to today. But yeah, the Air Force's up arrows were primarily GCAP, which is jammed tomorrow, extension of Typhoon, and some F-35s. Interestingly, it didn't talk about numbers of F-35s. It didn't even mention the B model. I think what's going to happen is if these CCAs, these collaborative combat aircraft, we're avoiding the D word, are going to come about and they genuinely work off the carrier, for example, then I think you will very quickly see a switch to those and no more Bs. I think if that comes off, that's where risk will be further taken on the number of F-35s and the type variant. So I know the initial plan was 12 F-35As. I think it could go beyond that. Whether the money covers that, I don't know. But
yeah, and I was sort of, we definitely don't have time for this, but I was sort of wondering whether there will be a bit of a death knell for the two big carriers, because you need at least 4 to be able to have a continuous at-sea capability. And if we're going to a model where you have to be prepared instantly, 2 carriers doesn't do it. And we haven't resourced them properly, and they haven't got the full suite of ships. We're taking Type 45s off the table. I mean, maybe it's just that the government didn't have the appetite for that, since it was a Labour government that, Gordon Brown, that approved them. I mean, we've got no time now, but I think so given the fact that the newspapers are dominated by there's not enough money, Starmer's got a black hole, what's your sort of headline assessment of the dip? A positive net story or a missed opportunity?
Oh, blimey. It's neither good nor bad. So a lot of people have decided this is rubbish and they've just written it off. This is a big mistake. I think that is just not true. There is new money here. There's new thinking. There's new approaches. There's genuinely a matchup now between the ambition and the reality of what technology can bring to the table. Now, hopefully, we've not had hundreds of snake oil salesmen surrounding us, and they've all convinced us. But you only have to sit at home at your own computer or in your own household to know that the world has moved on. So what can we do to exploit that in the military space? And I think Ukraine have shown the way here. But we've also got to be careful. We're not trying to fight another war like Ukraine. And there's quite a few people that are literally trying to make us into Ukraine. Well, that's a mistake too. So we do still need the high-end stuff. So this dip has tried to pull off a bit of a magic trick. It's tried to embrace the new tech. It's tried to accept that it still needs strong conventional power. It's also tried to keep us in the nuclear game. If anything, strengthen the nuclear game with a bit of tactical air as well, and try and do all of that in a funding envelope that is absolutely paper thin, because we're arguing about the odd billion quid, and we're not talking about things here that just cost the odd billion quid. So getting to that 3%, and heaven forbid that 3.5%, this actually becomes really quite exciting. The problem is, to get to that time, i.e. 2030 to 2035, we're going to continue to take risk on the conventional force we have today and just shore it up and hope that a war doesn't start, and hope that it is good enough to deter, on the basis that we just don't have a safety net anymore. And we've decided not to pay for the safety net in order to pay for the future. And, we might have to roll quite a few sixes.
What about the ballistic missile defense?
So here, I've heard this said by others. Who has it said it? I've got a sneaky feeling it might have been, it was discussed about Zelensky. We are going to have a long, hard think as a nation about our resilience in the event of a conflict. A ballistic missile attack on the UK would be horrible. Yeah, it would blow something up, or blow many things up. Well, okay, look at Ukraine. It happens daily. You're going to have to find a way to pick yourself up, cope with it, and find a way around the node that's now been taken out. I think that's the challenge for the UK. We don't have the resilience. So the idea that we're going to pay for an Iron Dome and just protect it, that ain't going to happen. What's not been said, if you remember, that NATO commitment of 3.5 was actually for 5%, of which 1.5% would be spent on resilience. So what are we going to spend it on? Now, we've seen Italy spend it on tunnels to Sicily or whatever. Now, because you can make up any, HS2, that'll be HS2, that's what we'll spend it on. What we need to spend it on is redundancy within, or hardening within some of our systems and some of our networks, whether that's undersea cables, power stations, or whatever it might be. And we kind of need to build back some of that resilience. We are not going to shoot every high-tech missile out of the sky. What we need to be able to do to deter Russia from thinking that that is even viable is not giving them the belief that it will make much difference, that we will do exactly what Ukraine does every night, dust ourselves off, wake up in the morning and get on with it, and then throw twice as much back at them. So, yeah, I think we've got to stop thinking of this shooting the arrow down. I think we've got to think about how we become resilient to arrows and how we go find the archer and deter them. So, I hear you. I think we just cannot take the American or the Israeli approach, which I don't think works either. We've seen that in Israel. I think you would see it in America too. There will be holes. I think that's why Donald Trump wants Greenland, to be honest.
But I think it's an interesting one. We don't have, for another podcast maybe. But I do wonder that the public, I think, expects an Iron Dome, and I'm absolutely with you. We would spend a whole of our GDP on that sort of thing, and I'm not sure that will be the right way to act. Having my most recent trip to Ukraine, you see the impact of these missiles, and it is tragic. A couple of people die, and I'm not belittling that, but 8 people die on the roads of this country every day in driving accidents. It doesn't stop us driving. So, having that degree of resilience and redundancy, I think, is far more important.
If you remember, we wrote our book to try and wake people up to the realities of what might happen. And I think that's what's important here. If the UK public is sitting here thinking that it's 2.5%, 3% of GDP makes them, completely immune to the tentacles of Russia, wake up. It doesn't. 5, 6, 7% might, because Russia, we'd basically just completely take Russia out in a heartbeat. But we ain't going to spend that. If you don't spend that, there is a risk, and the risk is that you might wear one back here. Stop seeing Ukraine as a country on another planet in another time zone. That could be the UK. It could be NATO. Now, do we think Russia's going to do that? We all hope he won't. But if he did, I think we've got to stop trying to think about spending endless amounts of money, becoming immune to things, and start hardening ourselves up to the reality that if you don't spend enough on deterrence, that is what will happen.